Hello everyone, my name is Gabby, and welcome back to another Dragon Ball Super review. This time reviewing episode 124. As Goku and Vegeta team up on Jiren, Frieza begins to have trouble with Dispo after he reveals his trump card to let him go even faster. Gohan steps in to save him, and the two of them work together, with Frieza limiting Dispo's movements so Gohan can fight him straight on. But just as Gohan is about to win, Frieza runs out of stamina to keep his attack up, freeing Dispo. So before he can get away, Gohan grabs Dispo and tells Frieza to eliminate both of them, sacrificing himself. So, what did I like about this episode? Well, first of all, in the Dispo fight in particular, there was a lot of surprising attention to continuity and detail. One of the biggest legitimate storytelling issues that people have with the Tournament of Power is that sometimes there feels like there's a bit of inconsistency in between episodes. That sometimes some characters feel like they're bigger threats in some episodes and yet they're smaller threats in other episodes, and it makes the episodes feel like they're separate self-contained stories rather than one part of one big whole tournament, which is what it's supposed to be. But in this episode, the actions of all of the characters feel very much defined by the things that happened in previous episodes and their actions in previous episodes. We had Frieza explaining what Dispo's weakness was from the last time Goku fought him, and then we had Dispo showing his own trump card to try and sort of deal with that flaw. We had the fact that when it looked like Frieza was going to betray Universe 7, the other characters weren't actually that upset or that worried because they remembered that the last time that happened with Frost, it turns out Frieza was basically just putting on a ruse to try and get rid of their enemies. And then we have when Gohan steps in to fight Frieza. While Frieza explains that he could easily betray him again, Gohan pretty much just puts his foot down and pretty much says he's not going to let that happen. If that happens, he's just going to try and eliminate him himself. It's nice to see these moments. It makes it feel like the first fight with Dispo and the fight with Gohan and Frieza were actually things that were actually important and were kind of building up to this episode. Hopefully that was actually an intentional part of those earlier episodes, but we're probably not going to know for sure. Also, while I did definitely want to see him stick around for longer, I did actually appreciate the way that Gohan's defeat was handled. Like, the implication in this episode was that if Dispo was so much of a threat in his full power that he was even giving Golden Frieza a run for his money, obviously it means that if Dispo was left to his own devices, he could really screw up everybody else's chances in Universe 7. And after Gohan and Frieza's big strategy to defeat him failed, the fact was that was basically the last chance they really could have had to defeat him. It felt like Gohan was making a very kind of clear, logical judgment here and sort of deciding that it was probably more important to get Dispo out than to potentially be able to help with Jiren and Toppo, given that, there are still members of Universe 7 to go. It's not like he's the absolute strongest, and at the very least, this is definitely going to help everybody. And it's also nice because it does mean that Gohan actually gets to go out on his own terms, which is something that you can't say for some of the other characters in Universe 7. It may not have been the absolute best way he could have gone out, and there were definitely more things that they could have potentially done with him even in this episode, but I do think it was an exit that was somewhat suitable for his character. As for what I didn't like about this episode, well, once again, I'm starting to feel like a broken record here, but why do the villains keep having all these trump cards with no discernible weaknesses that they only seem to be bringing out at the very last moment when it's dramatically appropriate? In this case, I'm talking about Dispo's super speed mode. I mean, for one, it's a little bit disappointing to have Dispo's response to the fact that his movements might be fast, but they're also kind of easy to read. Just be like, well, then I'll just get even faster, and then it won't matter if my movements are easy to read, because then I'll just be too fast for that to even be an issue. But also, you'd also think that this super speed mode would have really come in handy back when he was fighting Hit and Goku and kind of almost getting eliminated there. Like, you'd think if he had a trump card that could even beat Golden Frieza, he would try that against Hit and against Goku. Also, while I can at least appreciate how Gohan's defeat was handled, I do admit there was one thing about it that I think was the reason as to why people are kind of sort of almost shocked and a little bit disappointed over how it went. In that, what's kind of weird about the defeat and about the fight was that Gohan and Frieza had an actual proper strategy to try and deal with Dispo, and it seemed like it was an actually really good strategy, and it was basically working until it was defeated, not by having the villain be too powerful for it, but just because Frieza couldn't hold it up for as long as he needed it to. Like, it's just a kind of odd idea for a story beat. Having this big triumphant teamwork moment fail not because the villain is too powerful, but because the heroes are too weak. I feel like the story has kind of conditioned us into thinking that, if there's going to be a big teamwork moment, the only reason it would fail is if the opponent was just way too powerful. So having a moment like this kind of almost feels a little out of place. It's almost like giving the heroes a big beam struggle, only to have them actually lose the beam struggle in the end. It's a possibility that could actually happen, but it's just such a strange possibility that kind of seems to go against the idea of including it in the first place, that you don't really expect that to be an outcome at all. Plus, it also leads into this very unusual situation where Gohan only gets eliminated not because of his weakness, but because of Frieza's weakness. And that is kind of odd, especially given that Frieza is not the kind of character who would honestly start thinking of that as a personal failure and trying to make up for it. So as for next episode? Well, besides the fight with Jiren, there is only one other opponent left on the field, and that is Toppo. So the remaining characters are going to be fighting Toppo, but considering this is the guy who did seem to give Goku a run for his money before we even really got to see what he could do, obviously we can't exactly underestimate him, especially given that it seems like he's got some kind of trump card that he's also going to use. It's going to be interesting to see how they kind of structure these fights, because now there are only really kind of like 2 fights going on simultaneously. Maybe next week the fight with Jiren is actually going to progress in a meaningful way? Who knows, but it's going to be interesting to see what exactly Toppo is here for, and what Jiren is here for, and how this stuff is all going to interconnect. So that was Dragon Ball Super episode 124. I think it was better than a checklist episode, but it still was a little bit disappointing. There was some fun teamwork interactions, a surprising amount of continuity from previous episodes, and a character got eliminated but got to get eliminated on their own terms. That being said, the fight didn't really have that much of substance to it animation-wise, and there wasn't really much of a closure for some of these characters. Like every member in Universe 7, Gohan seems to just get out because it's his time, and not because there's some kind of reason for it. And like a lot of the other opponents in the Tournament of Power, Dispo gets out because it's his time, and not because it feels like there was a specific purpose for him that has now been fulfilled. I'm not going to lie, it is a little bit disappointing, especially considering we just found out that Dragon Ball Super is going to be ending soon, which means that this is probably going to be the last thing of note we're ever going to see Gohan do as a character for the foreseeable future, but at the same time, there's nothing really bad or wrong about this episode that makes it that way. So at the end of the day, it's not really that much of a bad episode. It does kind of make me feel a little bit empty, but that's not because there was something in the episode itself that was really kind of lacking. It's becoming increasingly clear that a lot of these characters in the Tournament of Power don't really feel like they're there for a very specific character moment reason, but rather they're just all kind of there to provide some interesting fights and some interesting dynamics. So at this point, it doesn't really feel like the climax is going to be this one big, very heavily structured thing that's going to bring all of the different extraneous elements together. That's a little bit concerning for the climax to actually be big and memorable, but I guess it can still be big and memorable without it necessarily keeping every character relevant. I guess we'll just see how it goes. So this is Gabby signing out, and I'll see you all next week. Bye guys!